A little over a year ago, I designed and built this sled, but there's one thing I want to change, and it's these wing nuts that I'm using to tighten down the bars. As you can see, the ones that are not tightened down tend to turn, and that's making me a little bit nervous beside this spinning blade. I want to replace those wing nuts with cam clamps that I designed and make myself. The first step is to make a tap, to tap out the threads that match the bolts that are in the sled. So I've got a piece of threaded rod, and I'm just going to cut a slot in it. And the reason why I'm making my own, even though I have a tap this size, is that when you make it from threaded rod, it's a much tighter fit. Whereas a metal tap that you buy is going to be a looser fit. And that's important because I'm going to be tapping into wood. Before I did any of this, I worked out a design for the cam clamp, and I 3D printed one to test to make sure that it works. And another improvement to the sled was to replace the standard nuts that I had on there originally to hold those bolts in place with 3D printed ones that are lower profile and also a little bit bigger so that they'll slide more freely. So to get started making this from wood, I need to go to my scrap wood closet and select a piece. This is a chunk of ash left over from building my bed a couple years ago. And the first step is to cut off the edge that has the dovetail in it because I don't need that. And then I need two pieces from here that I can glue together. And you'll notice that the grain is going the short way, not the long way. And it needs to be that way for strength. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. I get that clamped up and let it dry. And in the meantime, I've got a piece of black walnut that I'm going to cut into a thin strip. Now I've got my full sheet sandpaper holder. That's another project from a couple of years ago, clamped in place on my workbench so that I can smooth that strip of wood. In the meantime, the glue dried on my blank, and now I can cut it to size. I'm going to cut some off one side, then I'll move the fence over to the final thickness, which is 1 1/4, and make the second cut to bring it down to the right thickness. Now these cuts that I'm making here are for that spline. And what the spline does is it adds a lot of strength to this piece of wood. It basically turns it into a fancy piece of plywood, at least on that edge. And it's important that that edge be very strong because that's the edge that's going to get drilled out. And you'll see that later. I want to make sure that I got total coverage of glue on both sides of these splines before I push them all the way in. The next day I smoothed the sides once again on my full sheet sandpaper holder. And the night before I printed this template sheet that's covered with these suggestive looking shapes. But these are the cams and the center point for the holes that I need to drill. I need to roughly cut out each one so I can glue them onto the face of the blank. And this is where I have to pay attention to make sure that I'm putting the fat end of the cam on the edge that is reinforced with those splines. I need 8 of these in total, so I'm going to make all of them from this single blank. Then it's over to my homemade bandsaw to start cutting them out. The only problem is I'm kind of jumping the gun here. I cut out this first one before doing an operation that I really need to do, and that's to cut a slot that needs to be in this cam to clear the bolt. And it makes sense to do that before I cut the parts out. The one that I already cut can be cut on the bandsaw with it held in a clamp to make sure that it doesn't rotate. smooth those cuts on my belt sander and continue cutting out the rest of the cams. And with them all roughly cut out, I can sand them smooth on my homemade belt sander. And on my mostly homemade spindle sander. And the sanding drum that's in here has gotten really dull, so I need to change that out. This gives me a chance to show off my 3D printed sanding drums that replaced the rubber ones that shrunk and didn't fit anymore. These ones hold onto the sanding sleeve perfectly. Now to drill the holes in here, I need to slide a piece of wood in to make sure that I don't get blowout when it goes through that top layer. And now you can see why that spline is important. When you remove that much material from the end of the cam like that, it makes it very weak. And the splines that I added with the grain going in a different direction make the ends strong enough so that they won't split. Then I can get rid of the templates that I glued on and bring them outdoors and spray on some clear finish. Now I'm back to the scrap wood closet to pick out another piece of wood. This time I need to make a dowel that will be all the barrels for the cams. And I'm going to cut that to size first and then lay out the locations for the holes that I need to drill while it's still square and drill those out. And the holes need to be threaded as well, so I'll do that now using a guide to make sure that it's going in straight and my homemade tap mounted in my drill. I can quickly get that done. I'm going to use my router table and a 3/8 inch roundover bit to turn that blank into a dowel. This is my favorite way to make a dowel. And yes, this looks dangerous, but of course it's not. My fingers are not actually close enough to that spinning cutter to cut my fingers. And I need to check the fit. This is perfect. You don't want this too tight. Then I can use the cams themselves to mark out the length of each of the barrels and use my mini table saw sled to cut them to length. And believe it or not, once those barrels are cut out, the project is finished. The only thing left to do is to test them out. And yes, this works great. And even if they unscrew themselves, there's no metal here to fall into the spinning blade.